unexpected. It leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions. It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted out of the corner cafe inside. A mix of chatter and clinking cups created a warm, inviting atmosphere. Barron Trump sat at a small table near the window, his tall frame slightly hunched over a thick book. He wasn't trying to draw attention, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans blending into the crowd. Also, he thought he had come here for a simple reason: a moment of quiet. As the youngest son of a former president, his life had often been a whirlwind of public appearances and scrutiny, but here, among strangers sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones, he felt an unusual sense of anonymity. Barron was engrossed in his book when a sudden sharp voice cut through the cafe's hum. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The voice was loud enough to stop conversations. Heads turned toward a man standing a few feet away from Barron's table. The man looked to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a fiery expression. He wasn't dressed poorly, but his clothes had the unmistakable wear of someone who'd seen hard times. His tone was confrontational, his body tense for a moment. Barron froze, not out of fear, but out of surprise. This wasn't something he'd anticipated. When he'd picked this cafe for a quiet afternoon, the tension in the room thickened as all eyes focused on the unfolding scene. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man continued, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone. Barron's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the man's intensity. He closed his book, slowly placing it on the table, and looked up at the man. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The cafe fell eerily silent. People waited, holding their breaths for what would happen next. But instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron did something no one expected, and it changed everything. Barron leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. The man's anger seemed to pulse through the room, making even those watching from afar feel uneasy. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," he said calmly, his tone disarming. The unexpected offer took the man aback for a moment, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. He stood there, fists clenched, glaring down at Barron. The man sneered, "Why would I want to sit with someone like you? You're just another spoiled kid who'll never know what it's like to live in the real world." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. The barista made a subtle movement, as if considering whether to intervene, but Barron kept his composure. "Maybe you're right," Barron admitted, his voice measured. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like for a second." The man seemed to falter. The firmness in Barron's voice wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. Yet instead of taking the seat, the man leaned in closer, his voice dropping but retaining its sharp edge. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" He snapped, his words dripping with sarcasm. Barron's gaze didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he said, his words hung in the air, cutting through the silence. The man hesitated, as if unsure whether to lash out again or accept the unexpected civility. Meanwhile, the other customers continued to watch, their curiosity now mingled with an odd sense of hope. They weren't sure where this was heading, but they couldn't look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. He dropped into the seat, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning Barron as if searching for a crack in his calm demeanor. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tension in the cafe shifted, not entirely gone, but no longer suffocating. The barista lowered her hand from the Phone. The patrons leaned in slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop but hanging on every word. Barron nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening," he said simply. And so the man began to speak, but what came next wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if trying to steady himself. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but no less raw. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything." He began, his words heavy with bitterness. He glanced around the cafe as if daring anyone to interrupt before his gaze landed back on Barron. "I had a job, a family, a decent life. But then the factory I worked at shut down, just like that, gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but promises. They'd relocate us, promises that never came true." The cafe was silent save for the faint sound of the espresso machine hissing in the background. The man's voice began to crack as he continued, his tough exterior crumbling with each sentence. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, worked whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you. My wife, she left, took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore." He paused, his eyes glistening. "I can't even blame her." Barron remained silent, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the empathy in his eyes. The man's gaze shifted to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood absently as if trying to ground himself. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing? That's my life now. Every single day." The words hit hard, not just for Barron, but for everyone listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted in her chair, suddenly engrossed in her coffee cup, as if trying to process what she just heard. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, "sitting here with your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world, and it makes me mad because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. Barron didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's pain settle, respecting its weight. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Barron said softly, "but I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly know about that?" Barron's response wasn't what anyone in the cafe expected. It turned the conversation and the entire mood of the room. In a way, anyone in the cafe expected. It turned the conversation and the entire mood of the room. In a way, no one could have predicted. Barron took a deep breath, his steady composure making the tension in the room feel less suffocating. He leaned forward, meeting the man's skeptical glare with unwavering eyes. "You might think I've got it easy because of my name, and in some ways you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table, but that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood." Barron began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone in the cafe lean in a little closer. The man scoffed, ready to interrupt, but Barron held up a hand, not in a dismissive way, but as if to say, "Hear me out. Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done. Just because of my last name, they don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto, kind of like what's happening here." The man's face twitched as if Barron's words had struck a nerve. He didn't say anything, but his posture shifted ever so slightly, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. Barron continued, his tone measured but genuine. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours, they're not, but pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible or like you'll never be understood, that's something we all face no matter where we come from." The cafe was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that feels thick with thought. Even the barista had stopped mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb what he just said. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to Understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees, and maybe we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did. The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out again, but instead he exhaled sharply as if releasing something heavy he'd been holding on to for far too long. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Barron nodded. "I do, and I think maybe deep down you do too. Otherwise you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but then he looked back at Barron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer now. But the real surprise wasn't what Barron said next, it was what the man did in response. The man sat back in his chair, his body language shifting from guarded to contemplative. For a long moment he didn't say anything. The cafe was still, every patron caught in the quiet tension of the moment. Finally he spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier hostility. "You know, I came in here mad at the world," he said, shaking his head. "Mad at people like you who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all." Barron didn't respond right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured. "I think it's easy to blame people we don't know. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and I respect that." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Barron's for the first time. There was no trace of anger, only a wary kind of gratitude. "You're a good kid," he said almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. "I don't say that often." The shift in tone was palpable. The tension that had gripped the cafe dissolved, replaced by an unexpected sense of connection. The barista smiled faintly as she resumed her work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Then the man did something that caught everyone off guard. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched. Barron hesitated for only a second before clasping it firmly. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you." Barron smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back. He stood smoothing his shirt awkwardly and glanced around the cafe. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I came in here angry, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we've just got to listen." The cafe erupted in quiet applause, not loud or showy, but heartfelt. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way to the door. He paused just before leaving and looked back at Barron. "Thank you," he said simply. And then he was gone. What happened next wasn't as dramatic, but it left everyone in the cafe with something to think about, and it's a moment they wouldn't soon forget. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. Conversation slowly resumed. But they weren't the same. There was a new energy in the room, a shared understanding among strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Barron returned to his seat, picked up his book, and took a sip of his now cold tea. But before he could fully retreat back into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She looked to be in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Young man," she said softly, "I just want to say what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did, and I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Barron nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am. I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled and returned to her table, leaving Barron to his thoughts around him. The cafe buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Patrons were smiling at each other, striking up conversations and offering small gestures of kindness, holding doors, sharing smiles, and even picking up tabs. By the time Barron left the cafe, the day felt brighter, not just for him but for Everyone who had been part of that moment, the man's anger, Barron's empathy, and the simple act of listening had created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion as Barron walked down the street. He couldn't help but think about how small actions could have such a big impact. He didn't know the man's full story, and he probably never would, but in that cafe for those few moments they had connected, and that connection had changed the tone of an entire room. Maybe that's all it takes. Sometimes Barron thought to himself, just a little bit of empathy to remind us we're not so different. After all, this story isn't just about Barron or the man he met that day, it's about all of us, the way we carry our struggles, the way we judge others, and the way we can choose to listen instead of react. If this story moved you, take a moment today to practice a little kindness, and if you'd like more stories like this one, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's spread a little more understanding, one story at a time.